Hey everybody, I'm Evan Owens. This episode is one you're not going to want to miss. 25% of the population in our country struggles with addiction. It might be something that maybe you've struggled with in the past, or maybe it's something that you know someone very closely is struggling with. And today I have an incredible guest, Dr. Chip Dodd, who's not only an expert in this, but he's an expert in so many other things as it relates to matters of the heart. I'm super excited. I know you are as well. So let's get started. Welcome to the Reboot Recovery Show. I'm Evan Owens. This is where we're overcoming trauma together so we can embrace a brighter future. For a change, I'm not going to do much talking today, I hope. I'm going to do more questions and more learning. And it's because throughout my time at Reboot, one of the things that I have learned is that there's always some people that we need to lean on who are a few steps ahead of us in the journey. There are people who have been doing it a little bit longer, and certainly in our world, and Jenny and I's world, there are people that when we first meet them, we can tell this is not only a person who knows what they're talking about, but this is a person who we can learn something from. And from the very first time I met our guest today, it was clear that he not only had a gift for speaking to issues of the heart, but he also had a gift for being able to help people out of places where they were stuck, places where they were hurting. And so today with me, I'm very excited to introduce somebody that you may already be familiar with. Dr. Chip Dodd is with us today. If you are unfamiliar with some of his work, I encourage you to Google it. He's written, how many books now, Chip? You've written a bunch.
Seven.
Yeah, seven.
Two co-authored.
That's right. 7 books. He's on podcasts all over the country. He speaks all over the country. He's trained churches. He's trained individuals. He even does counseling and mentorship, both independently and in groups. And just somebody who is a wealth of knowledge. He's also somebody that really, even in Jenny and I's life, even though we've only known him for a short time, he's just been such an encouragement and in some ways an instigator of change in our life, an instigator of conversations that need to happen. And I know that as you listen to this today, he'll do the same for you. So first off, Chip, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Hey, thank you, Evans. And I really enjoyed Jenny too. A lot of people don't get to meet Jenny on the podcast, but she's a mainstay in the whole process, isn't she?
She is. And Jenny is, she's the one who keeps me humble, because without her, I would just walk around telling everybody how great I was all the time. So it works out.
It was funny. You said, I won't be doing all the talking today about yourself, asking questions. I was just thinking, we've got 2 donkeys from Shrek. Sonia says, I'm like the donkey on Shrek.
Yep, that's about right. Well, I want to talk first. You have a fairly new book, new-ish. It's called Hope in the Age of Addiction, and you wrote it with another friend of ours, Stephen James. And I want to just talk about this issue of addiction. I know so many of our listeners on this show have struggled with addictions. Sometimes addictions that develop suddenly after a traumatic event, or other ones that kind of crept in the back door and grabbed you before. So I guess first off, just talk to me about why is it that addiction is so easy to catch? Why is it that addiction is so prevalent in our lives?
I love that you described it as what makes addiction so easy to catch. And I love that you said catch, because it is an illness. It's like a virus. And if you're susceptible to it because of your immune system is down, then you're very likely to get infected by it. And it enters us through our wounds. So, I want to, carry that metaphor since you brought it up. We hadn't thought about it yet, but that's a great metaphor. And what's amazing is that I've even been invited up in early June to work with a church all weekend of about, 1,000 people up there only on addiction. So think about how beautiful and open it is. And also it speaks to how big of a problem it is. But that this is not something that needs to be hidden anymore, nor do we need to have to be embarrassed about it. But addiction is probably the majority issue problem in our country. And that 25% number, I think that's low. Honestly, I think that's minimizing the numbers, especially when you start to understand what addiction really is, because addiction is not a badness. Addiction is really an illegitimate attempt to have what we're made to have to live a full life.
Oh, wow.
It's not in and of itself. It's not a badness, because nobody plans to become addicted and to be enslaved, possessed, or controlled by what started out as a solution to stop pain. So addiction is an illegitimate attempt to have a full life, because we don't know what to do or how to manage or handle vulnerability. We don't know what to do with feelings. And we know that all addiction has one thing in common, whether it's alcohol, drugs, sex, cosmetics, power, exercise, control, money. You see the list. Almost anything we touch, we can get addicted to. But the core issue around addiction is it's something we do to change the way we feel, because we don't know what to do with the feelings. And you know from Reboot more than anything that trauma means that we've experienced occurrences in life for which we had no emotional outlet to process, express, or heal from those events. So it literally is trauma freezes, like this old coffee commercial. They would show this coffee that was just ground and just open in the air, and all of a sudden it go, and it would close real tight, and then all the air would be sucked out, vacuum packed. And trauma really is something that freezes the feelings and then begins to suffocate us. And then we find some self-cure, some path, some way to get relief from suffocation or possession or anxiety or just discomfort. Because when feelings come up, we become anxious. And we're anxious about being vulnerable again. That's a lot, but it's not a badness. It's an attempt to have the life we're made to have without having to pay the price of feeling or being vulnerable again or being helpless.
Yeah, and I love what you said, that it catches and that it enters through our wounds. I love that word picture. Let me ask this. Are there people who struggle with addiction or who battle against addiction who didn't have woundedness, who don't have trauma? Is there anyone that has addiction in an isolated chamber of existence? Or is addiction always a response to a woundedness?
Always, because what happens is once a person's wounded, and I've never met, and I've been working in the world of addiction for 30 years, and people who, went from Harvard all the way down to Hoboken, I'm saying? It's just from the penthouse to the outhouse. And it's the same thing over and over again. It's that the people do not know what to do with vulnerability. They don't know what to do with feelings because something's happened. They got wounded, and then they found a cover for those wounds, and that's the armor. Yeah. And the armor keeps more things from penetrating, but you have to have something to stop the bleeding. So what it means is the armor means people can't get in.
Right.
But some secret self-cure can. We drink it, so to speak. You drink power, whatever. So we're armored up against vulnerability, which is the key to having a full life. So, it's a catch-22. The very thing that can hurt you is the very thing that will save you. The very thing that saves you, yes, it can hurt you. But once we've been wounded, we made a vow. It's not going to happen again.
Right.
I'm not going to let that happen again.
And I have found that working with people who struggle with addictions is one of the most challenging characteristic traits to work with, because a lot of times there's the readiness and there's the willingness, but the ability, right? I think of what Paul said, what I want to do, I don't do, and what I do, I don't want to do, right? And you mentioned this sort of enslavement to the addiction. And I think a lot of our people who listen to this show, I think that's what they would say. They would say, I feel a little bit like I'm enslaved to this thing that happened to me. And we see this not just in addiction, we see it even in the voice of the person who was their abuser. Sometimes that person's long gone, and yet the abuse continues emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, even though that person's out of their life, right? I mean, there's this sense that I'm captured, I'm not at home anymore, I'm hurting, and I can't seem to escape. And I love that you guys titled the book, Hope in the Age of Addiction. What about it makes this the age of addiction? Why is this the age of addiction, right? I mean, you could have said hope through addiction, hope and addiction, but you said in the age of addiction. Why are we in the age of addiction right now?
Well, I think if we think about this, that that addiction occurs through, number one, you are oppressed in heart. Okay, you're oppressed. Outside influences tell you to hide what God has made to be expressed. Okay, does it make sense?
Yes.
And then because we're made for relationship, that's the core issue of everything. God has created us human beings to find fulfillment in relationship with being able to use my brain to speak my heart, being able to be in heart with you and God. Mm-hmm. And so once we are oppressed, we hide the heart, and then we become obsessed, or like you say, a false self. What do I need to do to get people to belong and matter, get my needs met? Because just me being vulnerable myself ain't going to work. And then we find a self-cure, and that's what possesses us. So that's the process. Mm-hmm. And what makes it so powerful today, it's not because addiction is new, but because we have more ways and more methods of becoming addicted. For example, the technology, the phone, Silicon Valley. We can reach across the world and go to the pornography of Bangkok without having to fly there. So I mean, it's because it's readily available. A 16-year-old in 1960 something did not have that 16-year-old had to leave his or her house to go find the addictive thing. Right now, they push a button and the snake's in the room with one button.
Man, that's so good.
Availability is number one. Number two is that we live in a world that is more and more detached from the core value system that the nation once used to hang on to or believe in or cling to. And God, family, loyalty, heart, prayer. And so we have a whole lot of ways when that doesn't work to find ways to go to other places. And a society that supports doing whatever you want. And then thirdly, I think we live in a time in which we see so much life happening out there that's false away from us. We think we're missing something. We kind of have the left out, missed out syndrome.
Right. Fear of missing out, FOMO, right? Fear of missing out. Yep.
Yeah. And so we live in a society that promises us that something's wrong with having pain. It tells you something's wrong with having pain. And the United States of America uses 95% of the narcotics that are produced in the world.
Wow.
Yes.
Wow.
So we are a society that is about not having to be in pain, when actually, believe it or not, pain is the doorway to the solution.
That's right. Yeah, you could say that again. Yeah, I mean, that's so good. I mean, I think that I didn't know it was as high as 95%, right? That we live in a numbing nation, right? That we're numbing people. And we talk a lot on this show about the desire to numb and run from the feelings and from the pain that we've encountered, certainly. And I also think that
there's nothing wrong with that, Evans. I mean, wanting to feel better is not a sin. Right. What we do to ourselves for that to happen can tear us to pieces and lead us into places we never wanted to go.
Yeah. And I want to talk real quickly. One of the things that I really admire about you and all of your writing, those of the people who are listening who are not involved in sort of the world of media and writing and content production, there is a lot to be gained if you're actually in the therapy world of actually helping people who are truly wounded, truly sort of lost, if you will, in their own journey. There's a risk that's to be taken if we say, well, we'll be kind of diet on the faith piece. We'll be a little bit watered down on the faith piece. We don't want to talk too much about faith. We're going to kind of focus on psychology. We're going to focus on the physiological response to things like this. But you have managed to consistently release content that somehow infuses these concepts of faith and spirituality and issues that are very, very, very psychological or very practical in nature. And I guess for the addict, what role does faith play And what role, let me ask you a different way. What role should it play if functioning properly? Because I've met so many addicts who distance themselves from the church because they're told some hurtful things, right? Who feel judged. They feel condemned based on their addictions they've struggled with. Meanwhile, many others in the church are struggling with more socially acceptable or more private addictions, right? And so I've run into so many people who say, oh, I'm done with the church because of those things. And so I've struggled sometimes. What do I tell them about the role faith could and should play in their journey, apart from what mean and hurtful people do, right? There's still a role of what God can play. What do you say to those kind of people? What role does faith play?
That's a phenomenal question. And that's what was so exciting. Even when we opened up the podcast, the church in Massachusetts in Boston has asked me, Southern boy, to come up there and talk to them about addiction, because we want healing and we want the church to lead this, because we had fallen behind. I'm like, oh man, I'm on the plane. Let's go.
Right.
And I'm going to be speaking on Sunday. I'll be like preaching 3 different times. So they're letting all in the church. Seminar all day on Saturday, and then, preaching on Sunday. So here's the thing, Evans. What's wild is back in, 25 years ago, I got into recovery myself, and found out the power, the presence, and the purpose of feelings. And then I wrote The Voice of the Heart. And the main sentence is that we're created. Number one, we're created. We didn't make ourselves. We're created as creatures who are emotional and spiritual. And emotional means we have feelings that move us, that initiate us, that connect us, that motivate us, okay? And we're spiritual, which means we crave to be connected to something bigger and greater than ourselves that's good. I mean, it's just in us. And we're created to find fulfillment in relationship. Okay, so I did this years ago. Then neuroscience has come along, and I had a doctor I treated years ago. He said, I believe everything you're saying, but you don't have science behind you. He said, I'm going to go get the science. So 2005, he walks out, we're in recovery, and he's a very well-known addictionologist now. He comes back 5 years later, like, a wanderer, comes back, kind of throws it on the desk, said, every single thing you're saying is true. Neuroscience backs up everything. They finally have caught up. Okay. Well, it turns out that neuroscience has shown us that human beings have an emotional brain and a thinking brain. And the emotional brain is in us at birth. The thinking brain develops later, usually about when we're 20 something. Okay. So the main thing we feed off of is emotional connection. And neuroscientists, where I was saying we find fulfillment through relationship, neuroscientists are saying we find fulfillment through connection to relationship, others, ourselves, and God. And they call it something bigger than yourself. Evolutionary biologists, now this is wild. Evolution, they don't want to get God involved at all. But they're saying that human preservation, survival of the fittest, the old evolutionary, plan card, says that we only find fulfillment and success through sticking together. And the strongest characteristic that lets us stay together is gentleness. Gentleness meaning that somebody could lean against me. Okay, with all that being said, that we are literally created to be in relationship with something bigger than ourselves. And then that's where we kind of have to contend with that we were created, that there's a creator. Exactly. And so in addiction recovery, the number one thing we have to face is, okay, there may or may not be a God, but I know this, I'm not God. And so in other words, I don't have all the answers. I'm not my own fix. I need something other than me. And then ultimately we find out for the human being to have real sense of fulfillment, they have to develop an intimate relationship with a being that is capable of relationship. And it turns out the only being that the world history has ever talked about that does relationship intimately with people he created is the God Almighty, who happens to be the Judeo-Christian God, who does intimate relationship with people who struggle and struggle openly in need. So, I mean, the faith. Now, the thing is, I was at one time critical of the church, but I've realized the church is the fellowship, the boat we need to get on, because it is the last bastion of strength in the world. And I'm not saying Alcoholics Anonymous isn't real close to church.
Right.
So I want to know that church has often rejected because of the willfulness of what addiction means, but the church needs recovery too, to open the doors to addiction recovery, because the church itself needs recovery. The church is a place that needs to be the heartbeat of God, and churches are catching up, if I may say it that way. But here's the thing too. I know I'm kind of like I'm competing. Wait a minute, who's going to talk?
No, this is exactly what I wanted to have happen. I think most of our listeners are probably thinking, why do I even listen to the Reboot Recovery Show? I just want to hear Chip talk. So if you want to, by the way, you can also go and subscribe to the How to Live podcast, right? That's the name of it, Chip, How to Live.
H. Hills. But Ephesians 4:17 through 19 says this beautifully. You mentioned Paul, like the very things I want to do, I don't. The very things I do wish to do, I can't. That kind of thing. He's struggling with not having control. And then he says, "Who is it that can help me, save me?" And then he goes into Jesus Christ. But Ephesians 4 says basically, our problem is this: that because of the darkness of our understanding, which means we're blind to facing reality, how life works, and the hardness of our hearts. So it says we put armor around our wounds. Then it says we have given up our senses, which means we've run from our feelings. And if you run from your feelings because they're still there, something's got to address it. It says sensuality takes the place of feeling. In other words, addiction. Right. Then it says no matter how much you eat, you continue to have a lust for more. Paul is defining addiction. He's saying what happens to you if you're not in touch with your heart and your heart isn't known to others and God.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, this is so good, and I know so many people are being helped. I know you've had thousands and thousands of people that you've personally worked with, in addition to people who have read the book, and of course, being one of the founders of Sage Hill years ago. Those of you who aren't familiar with it, go check it out. I mean, just an incredible, just a mission and a ministry and a counseling approach that really a lot of us stand on the shoulders of what you built. I mean, a lot of us who are doing this really are photocopies in some way of what you guys have created and the themes that you guys really were proposing back in the early, mid-90s, I suppose, right? I mean, that long ago.
I opened up a treatment center in 1996. I was out in Dallas from 89 to 95, started a counseling center out there with a partner. And I've been in this feeling thing. And I'm telling you, Evans, it's feelings. What to do with feelings, not reactions to them, but processing them. And then not only having the feelings, but where do I take them? That the ability to return to asking for help is the first step of healing trauma. Because in other words, making yourself vulnerable and facing that you can't do it by yourself. And then the next step is making a list. Kind of like, who do I call?
Right.
Because trauma is a crisis, and trauma is, crisis means danger and it means opportunity too.
Right. I'm glad you said what you said. It's a perfect segue for us. I mean, one of the things we talk about is, healing requires humility, but we also talk about this idea of building a support system, not a support person. Don't just have one person. Right? We talk about all this, and this is something that I think a lot of adults, a lot of parents are concerned about, which is, how can I help my child if they go through crisis? Because so many people who go through crisis, they experience wounds, and then out of that, they end up in some kind of addictive behavior. And we see this already even with our son. The things he's being exposed to at 8 years old, as opposed to things that I was exposed to at 8 years old, it's pretty shocking. It really is. And no matter how much of a greenhouse we want to put him in, no matter how much we want to shelter him and control all the weather and the temperature and the environment, the thing is he still has to be a light in dark places, even at a young age. And so one of the things that I wanted to ask about a little bit is, how do we go about preparing our children to resist addiction, but also to deal with personal crisis and woundedness when it happens, because we know, in fact, those strong feelings, they will happen, right? I mean, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And so I want to know, what should I tell my boys? What should I tell my 3 boys to start? How do I start preparing them, not only to deal with resisting addictions and things of that nature, but also to deal with their feelings, to deal with personal crisis, to deal with all that kind of stuff? What advice would you have for us?
That's great. Number one is that so much of what you're describing depends upon the parents. What you wanting for your children, the parents need to have. So, you as a parent, can you receive feelings? Can you process feelings? Do you know your own story? Do you live in a way that is truthful? And I don't mean free of mistakes. I'm just talking about truthful in heart. Then the next thing is you're letting your children know, because you're a person who can tell your story and have feelings yourself. In other words, you struggle too.
Right.
But you tell your children, like, this is home. Wherever you go, wherever you are, no matter what happens, you have a place to come to. The door's never locked, the table's set, and the light's on.
Right.
So because the wounds, we want most of the wounds to occur outside the house, as tragic as that sounds. And inside the house, if they occur, we seek forgiveness pretty quickly. So we've got to be vulnerable to facing ourselves and seeking forgiveness. But as long as a child has a place to come to have their tears and have their laughter, to have their protests and to have their needs, their dreams, then that child is at lower risk of addiction. Yeah. Because they have a place to deal with feelings.
Right. They have an outlet, right? They don't get bottled up and trapped. They have an outlet.
Yes, because every time they process feelings, they learn something more about life. And where does that go? It goes into the seat of long-term memory, because long-term memory is in your feeling brain, not in your thinking brain. Okay. It's not in your executive functioning. It's in the deep-seated emotional connection area. A second, or really third thing for parents is who is on your list.
Right.
So what I mean by that is, if you've got a plumber on your list, and you've got an electrician on your list, and you've got a car mechanic on your list, and you've got somebody you could talk to if y'all run into legal problems, and if you've got, and if you know a good preacher, and in other words, if you've got a list, you're more secure.
Exactly right.
And it's the same holds not only just for electricians and plumbers who are essential. Who do you call when your heart is aching? Who do you call when you don't know what to do? Who do you call when you're struggling with some time? You need some time away from your wife because it's too much female time.
Well, that's who we're all going to call. And his personal cell phone number is I'm just kidding.
Oh, Ghostbusters.
Right, exactly. Problem solved. Well, that was easy.
But you know what? Who's on your list? And most people with trauma don't have a long list.
Mm-hmm. That's totally right. That is totally right. They don't.
Lists tend to be me, myself, and I.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting, and I'm going to plug this back in over here. It's interesting. If I hear you correctly, something that I hear you saying that I could be way off base on, though, is that if I don't have an outlet for the emotions to come out, it's almost like the emotions back up, clog up the works, and make me sick. It's almost like it's like they stay in my system too long, and they start to become a virus, like a self-attacking kind of thing. And it is interesting because one of the things I hear also is this idea of relationship connectedness. It's so funny you talk about home. I was literally just talking to my team this morning about the homelessness that people who have been abused feel because they don't feel at home in their own bodies. They don't feel at home in their own homes. They don't feel at home in their own souls. They don't feel welcomed at home anymore, so to speak. And so I talk about that in what I was writing and speaking to the team, which is really funny. But one of the things that I try to do is sit down and have conversations with my kids that go deeper and talk about some of these things. And we had a previous guest, some of you who have listened to every episode, she said that her son started talking to her about, I forget, it was comic books or some superhero character, and she said, I could not have cared less what he was saying, but she said this phrase, she said, but I realized that while today he was talking to me about something that didn't matter, tomorrow he'd be talking about something that did matter, and I wanted him to know that I was setting him up to have that conversation then, because when I cared about the things that seemingly didn't matter, he knew I'd care about the things that did. And I think us as a lot of parents, we want to zone out, we want to tune out, we want to numb, we want to just go off to our phones, escape to Facebook, escape to Netflix, whatever it is, and have them do the same, sort of sit in their own corners, go to your own room, do your own thing. And I think one of the things for our listeners that you're doing, especially if you've dealt with your own trauma, I find that just talking to my son, and even though he's only 8, and I don't talk to my 5 and my 2-year-old much. My 2-year-old usually just wants candy or pudding, so it kind of works out. But I find that having those conversations, it's now, granted, I don't know what they'll turn out to be like as adult men, but I do pray and hope that these conversations are creating a bedrock, right, of showing them that these emotions, they have to get them out. Now, one question about emotions. There are some people that seem really very emotional, for lack of a better term. They tend to be pretty emotional and expressive. This is my oldest son. Then I have my middle boy, who he can bust his face wide open, cry one tear, and he's right back at it. And so what role does sort of natural selection, if you will, or natural personality play in expressing our emotions? There's people who I know who are very healthy emotionally, and yet they never actually express their emotions in a very strong, dynamic kind of way. They tend to be pretty tempered. So how can I judge if I feel like I'm working with someone or helping someone, or maybe I'm going through something? How do I judge? Well, I've had people say, well, what do you want me to do? Do you want me just to like cry forever? I guess, how do I use emotions to help me heal, especially if I'm a person who maybe, as a lot of our veterans and first responders listening, maybe they're not super sort of sappy people like me. Maybe they don't feel as deeply as I feel. So what advice, what kind of metric do they use? How would you approach that?
Well, here's the thing. Everybody feels the same. Everybody feels the same. I mean, that's DNA, that's creation. Everybody's created. Human beings all have 99.9% essential DNA, emotionally, spiritually, physiologically, okay? But that doesn't mean that we don't have uniqueness, okay? So, number one, everybody feels the same. But at the same time, temperament, disposition, genetic, other genetic coding, influences, impact, birth order, all that kind of stuff. But labeling it as unemotional or sappy, that's where the shame piece comes in. So number one, people express the feelings differently, but everybody has the same feelings.
Good. That's so good. Say that one more time.
Everybody expresses feelings differently.
But they all have the same feelings.
Everybody has the same feelings.
That's so good.
100% sure on that. Now, another thing is, like, there's no one path to grief. There's not a formula for grief. There is a need to grieve. Okay? There's not a formula that says this is exactly how you listen to someone, but there is a need to be listened to. Okay, so I want you to know that everybody's created the same, but the needs can be met differently. The feelings can be expressed differently, but they must be expressed. That's the key. They must be expressed. Now, what stops that from happening? Just forego. I'm just not a feeling guy, or I'm just not expressive. Okay, great, but you may not be expressive, but you are a feeling guy. Now, if you don't think you're a feeling guy, or if you think you're too feeling, both of those things may be controlled by what you've been told. In other words, toxic shame tells you shouldn't feel, or you shouldn't express it, or you shouldn't do it like that, or you should be more tough when you do it, or you should just gush like crazy, or you should fall apart. All those shoulds are lies.
Right.
All the shoulds should be a certain way is a lie.
Right.
So most of the time, especially men who have experienced great loss, tend to have great shame about experiencing how much they cared for what was lost. You want to say it again?
Yes. One more time. Give it to me again.
That men who have experienced great loss, predominantly men,
yes,
have a very difficult time letting the feelings come to the forefront about how much what they've lost matters or who they lost.
Right.
What they hoped life was going to be like, and it turned out the opposite. They'll blame themselves instead. How much they loved who they lost because they were so close to them in fellowship or in the process with them or in a battle with them. And there's the question, it's like, but this was a better man than I am. Or this was somebody that, like, how come not me? So instead of feeling the losses, we end up asking the questions, why? That's a head cognitive reasoning thing versus an emotional thing. So feelings have to be expressed for connection and healing and fulfillment to recur.
That's right. And it's so good because go ahead. I'm sorry. No, please go ahead.
Hope is regained through risk.
Yeah, and I love that it's all full circle, right? I mean, when feelings aren't expressed or we find substitute addiction behaviors to try and numb those feelings, you said that at the beginning, or try to avoid or substitute for those feelings. I love how it comes full circle and how this idea that I can help my kid develop resilience, I can help my child develop a resistance, if you will, to addictive behaviors, things like that, by allowing them to have a healthy place and teaching them how to process emotions without necessarily giving them some shame language about there's a right way to express the emotion versus a wrong, to kind of put a bow on it, right? I mean, that's
like your 8-year-old is it's very likely may see some of the world through a lens of how life could be.
Right.
And then your younger child may see life through the lens of this is the way it is.
Right. Not to mention one of them, has high expectations for himself. The other one, who's the second, is like, I'm awesome. I know I'm better than him. I'm just going to crush his spirit, So it works out that way. They have a competitive edge. The 2-year-old just sits and eats snacks, so it works out. He's like watching the fighting happen. He's like the kid with the popcorn, just kind of sitting there.
He's going to be the ultimate commentator, spectator in this.
Right. He's like, in the left corner. That's right. Hailing all the way from the bedroom on the right. That's like, it's like,
here they go again. Here
they go. No, that really is true. He kind of sits back and he just watches it happen like like maybe this will make the top 10. So one final question. So those of you who are listening, I really would encourage you, if you've been a fan of what Reboot has done, if you like our curriculums, if you like our podcasts, if you buy one of Chip's books, or if you tune into his podcast, or if they go to chipdodd.com, is it .com or .org? .com, yep. Which is DODD. If you go to one of those, first, I want you to know, not only will you not be disappointed, but more importantly, you'll find so many themes that are reoccurring between what he's saying and what we teach, but you'll also find his approach to it, this lens through being able to understand the heart, this lens through being able to understand feelings. I think you'll find is extremely beneficial for you in your journey. And I've even thought, I wish we could make it for every Reboot graduate. I wish we could give them a stack of books and say, here's 3 or 4 books that are mandatory reading that you need to read to fully understand. Because I think so many of us, we're just not given a very good playbook on how to deal with some of these things in life when we're growing up. And so I wanted to...
That is so true. It's not that we have failed. It's that in so many ways we haven't had the tools to succeed. Like you say, we got a lot of times the wrong playbook.
That's right. No, that's exactly right. And we actually talk about that theme a fair amount, that, it's not like you've just been messing up all these times. You've been figuring out all the ways that didn't work because nobody told you how to do it. Which is like me in every home repair project. I basically break it worse so I can learn how to fix it better. That's my MO on that kind of stuff. So one final question for you, which is maybe a little bit outside of the purview of what we're talking about here today, but there are a lot of people who go through a difficult time and then they want to help others. They want to then turn their pain into purpose and begin helping other people. And in a military culture specifically, there's a lot of veterans who decide, I think I'll be a social worker, right? This is a common theme. But yet a lot of them, I have found, struggle to deal with their own emotions. They struggle maybe still to heal from their own past. And so I'm always a little hesitant to say, dive headfirst into doing this full time. You've spent how many years now being really a counselor and a guide for people? How many years have you been doing this?
35.
35 years, right? I mean, so at some point you had to recognize, okay, this truly is my one of my purposes. This is part of my professional goals. But for some folks, maybe they're new to it. And I guess with all of your years of experience, what questions or what things do you wish somebody would have came to you 35 years ago and said, hey, Chip, here's something that I want you to be aware of. Before you get into counseling people and helping people full time, here's something that you should know. What would you say to yourself 35 years ago?
In fact, not only did I end up having to face what was said to me, then I had to say it to myself. But basically, almost everyone who goes into this field is wanting to give so people can have healing. Okay.
Right.
But are you giving what you've gotten, or are you giving what you think people need that you don't have? That's the big key.
That's good.
Yeah. If you go into it to fix people,
that's good.
You're going to harm yourself and others. If you go into it because you have found the process of healing and you want to help people along, and that's what I say, along. You said at the very beginning of this podcast, no one is superior above, but there are some people who are farther out, and they're coming back to let us know. So the number one thing about it really thriving in this world is you put the oxygen mask over your own face first in crisis. Like they say on an airplane, if you have a crisis, put the mask over your own face first and then help the people around you. So you have to ask yourself, as a wanting to be a helper, healer, just assistance, then do you have what you're offering? Wow. Do you have what you're offering? You can't give what you don't have. So, you've got to get in your own recovery. Is important. Recovery of heart. Not perfect, just process. Just be in the process for yourself.
Well, I remember there was a mutual friend of ours who was a pastor here in Nashville that you've done some work with. And I remember I met him one night after a conference that we were both attending. And he asked me if I knew this guy named Chip Dodd, and I said, no, I know of his books, but I don't know him personally. And he began to go on and tell me, and one of the things he said, man, it's like the first time I met him, it's like the guy read my playbook, he knew me, he was speaking into my life, and he just went on and on and on about it, to a point that I have to admit, I got a little uncomfortable. I started to think are you in a cult? Do you need help, right? Should I send backup, right? Should I call for backup? And so he told me this, and I'd run into him a few other times. He'd be like, dude, have you connected with him, Dodd yet? I'd be like, no, I haven't. He's like, oh man, you need to. This dude, he's just, and he would, it was like prophet, priest, and king type language. I mean, this was profound type of language,
We could create a marketing team.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, I'll happy to share that with you. I don't want to out him here publicly as somebody that receives counseling from you. That sounds like a bad idea. But all that being said is, I kind of forgot about it for 8 or 9 months. And then when we began working with folks at Baker, I realized, hey, you know what? This is crazy. Chip is also an author with the same group. Let me reach out to them and see. And we had our first conversation, and then we had our second conversation. After our first conversation, I came into the room and I told Jenny, I was like, I just had the most amazing meeting with this guy named Chip Dodd. And she goes, and I started saying, it's like he read my playbook. And Jenny's like, is this the dude that you used to talk to that other pastor guy about? And I was like, it is that same dude. And she was like, okay. And then later that night, she was like, I feel like I need to meet him. And I was like, you do. So we had our meeting, the two of us with you. And about 30 seconds into the meeting, Jenny leans over. She goes, it's like he's reading my playbook. It's like he knows everything about me. So my point is, what I'm going to say to you is I truly believe there are a few people that actually innovate, that actually create. I think most people and most organizations in this space, they really recycle and rephrase. But there are a few originators of thought, and you truly are that. And I want you to know that. I want to say that publicly. And so people who are listening, if you have not heard of him yet, he is not the best at marketing himself or promoting himself, but I'm telling you, there is a deep well, is the analogy we use with Jenny. There's a deep well of insight there, and you need to go check it out. Go buy his books, chipdodd.com. Go listen to his podcast, How You Live, or go listen to any of the Sage Hill podcasts. There's hundreds of those, I believe, by now. Probably you can find them at any of the other places. And thank you for joining us today. Thank you for listening to
Evans.
The
Listen,
Reboot. Yep.
I know I'm cutting in, but I jumped at the opportunity like I did with solo parenting, because what you're doing is helping individuals, just the one starfish that, there are thousands, but you're helping the one. And and I'm not turning this back to you only, but I appreciate what you said to me. But I am so grateful, thankful, and pray blessings upon what you're offering, because some of the greatest people in the world are some of the most hurt people, because they cared and risked. And then some of the greatest helpers in the world are the hurt people that somebody put out a hand towards. So
That's right.
and thank you for what you're doing, and thank you for what you said about me, because I'm always surprised when I hear that.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of my son said, Dad, you always really are genuinely surprised when somebody says, well, I love that book. I'm like, really?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that there's an element of counseling that is beyond cognitive. I think there's an element that, and I've met literally thousands of doctors and counselors and pastoral care people in my career. And I find that a lot of people have tons of head knowledge they've learned from books. There's a few people that are create, and then there's even fewer people who actually can do the creation plus the discernment to be able to read a situation. And I really think that obviously you have the spiritual gift of discerning things in conversations, and that's
the human gift of being real human.
Yeah, exactly. Hey, well, that's good. That's really good. And so, anyway, thank you for listening to this episode of the Reboot Recovery Show. Again, go check it out, chipdodd.com. Until next time, keep moving forward as we overcome trauma together. God bless.